With Joseph Andrews, published in 1742, 11 years after Manon Lescaut, we enter a completely different world. It's not tragic now, but comic. Here, the love story is that of a young couple whose mutual commitment is absolute. And after they surmount a series of obstacles, there is a supremely happy ending, after which we can be sure they will live happily ever after. Manon Lescaut is the personal story of a self-regarding aristocrat, a first-person narrator who is our sole source for everything in the story. Joseph Andrews is told by a genial and witty, omniscient narrator, who makes it clear that his goal is to entertain his readers and also to broaden their perspective on human behavior. This is very much a middle-class world, a world of roadside inns and country squires and country clergymen. Manon Lescaut is centered in Paris. Joseph Andrews is set in rural England, with London at the beginning as an over-sophisticated place to avoid. Like Don Quixote, which began as a parody of a popular literary form, Joseph Andrews, too, originated in a parody, which then took off in an unexpectedly creative direction. In 1739, 3 years previously, a printer and publisher named Samuel Richardson suddenly got an idea for a novel, which he published in 1740. He was middle-aged by then and had never written fiction before. One of his many publications was a collection of sample letters that purchasers might use as models. How to present a tactful complaint to an employer, for instance, or how to flatter a woman persuasively. The inspiration that came to Richardson was to create a novel made up of letters. That form became known as the epistolary novel. The letters are exchanged between the characters, and to readers that seemed very new and exciting. It gave a sense of real-time immediacy, people communicating right in the midst of their lives, not a story told retrospectively, as by Crusoe or Desclieux, and certainly not a story invented and shaped by a novelist. Richardson's pose was that he was merely an editor who had acquired these letters and gotten them into print. Richardson's novel was entitled Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. It's a kind of Cinderella story. Pamela is a servant in the household of a well-to-do squire, known only as Mr. B followed by a dash, as if his real identity is being protected. Pamela wasn't a common name at the time. It came from the old romances, and it was this novel that made it popular. Pamela is very pretty, and Mr. B conducts a campaign of seduction, but she bravely resists. In the end, he is so impressed with her wonderfulness that he makes her his wife. The low-born servant girl is now a fine lady. It's obvious why middle-class readers would have loved that outcome. Richardson also thought he was teaching important moral lessons. Mr. B is not a bad man, and when Pamela refuses to be seduced, he honors her goodness. Thus the subtitle, Virtue Rewarded. Henry Fielding thought all of that was blatantly artificial. People under stress don't sit down and write long letters about it, even to family or close friends. In addition, he thought that a servant girl who really did behave like Pamela would most likely be playing hard to get until she wins the big prize, marrying up. That wouldn't be virtuous at all in the way that Richardson meant it. There was indeed a tendency at that time to limit the connotations of the word virtue. Originally, it meant integrity in the largest sense, being true to one's best self. Now, increasingly, it was coming to mean simply sexual good behavior. So, in 1741, 1 year later, Fielding came out with a clever parody called Shamala, in which the heroine cunningly teases and manipulates Mr. B until he gives in and marries her. Fielding gave him a full name, too. Now he's Mr. Booby. Fielding also makes fun of Richardson's pretense of real-time reporting. At one point, Shamala is in bed with an elderly housekeeper, and at midnight she takes pen and paper to write to her sister back home. This is what she writes. Mrs. Jarvis and I are just in bed, and the door unlocked. If my master should come, odds bobs, I hear him just coming in at the door. You see, I write in the present tense. Well, he's in bed between us, we both shamming sleep, and he steals his hand into my bosom. Shamala was clever, but in the end it was only a parody. What's interesting is that Fielding evidently realized Richardson had hit on something a large audience was eager to get: believable stories about contemporary people and the practical and ethical challenges that they face. Defoe had been the groundbreaking pioneer 20 years earlier, but his novels were regarded pretty much as a form of journalism. Now in the 1740s, the modern novel was ready to establish itself as a mainstream form. Joseph Andrews, published 1 year after Shamala, began as a parody of Pamela too. In Richardson's novel, Pamela's last name is Andrews, and Fielding invents a brother for her, that's Joseph. At the beginning of the story, he too is a servant in the London household of Mr. B's aunt, with her full name spelled out like his, Lady Booby. Fielding knew his readers would notice that Booby sounds a lot like Bubby, which was common 18th century slang for the female breast. Lady Booby makes repeated lustful advances to Joseph, which he virtuously resists until she indignantly fires him. Fielding has fun exposing the hypocrisy of the double standard. Most of his readers would have believed that a young woman must never yield to sexual temptation, but many of the same readers would take it for granted that a young man would not resist, and maybe even shouldn't be blamed. They would chuckle at Lady Booby's astonished reaction when Joseph refuses her and says, just as Pamela did, that he's defending his virtue. "Your virtue," said the lady, recovering after a silence of 2 minutes. "I shall never survive it." Richardson wasn't a Puritan in a denominational sense, but he certainly had a puritanical distrust of the flesh, and he saw sex as a supreme moral test, a test that all too many people fail. Fielding would never have agreed that for a young woman to lose her virginity was the fate worse than death. In Fielding's opinion, sex is an especially enjoyable element in a happy life. It can be abused. His novels have many abusive characters whose selfishness and even sadism he exposes, but in Fielding's world of comic gratification, sex in itself is good. Very early in writing Joseph Andrews, Fielding must have realized he had something much more interesting to say than simply to make fun of Pamela. Joseph may have begun as a simple male counterpart to Pamela, but he soon becomes an interesting character in his own right. Joseph doesn't resist Lady Booby simply out of piety. He resists because he wants to be faithful to a young woman he's deeply in love with. Her name is Fanny Goodwill. Characters in comic novels often have type names that reflect their natures. When Fanny first enters the novel, Joseph is on the road, making his way from London back home to his village. He has stopped at an inn. Coincidentally, comic novels make free use of coincidence. A kindly clergyman named Parson Adams has just rescued Fanny from a would-be rapist and has brought her to the same inn. The narrator then pauses to describe Fanny, and he does so in much more vivid terms than the generalized accounts we had of the Princesse de Clèves or Manon Lescaut. Fanny was now in the 19th year of her age. She was tall and delicately shaped, but not one of those slender young women who seem rather intended to hang up in the hall of an anatomist, that means like a skeleton, than for any other purpose. On the contrary, she was so plump that she seemed bursting through her tight stays, especially in the part which confined her swelling breasts. Her eyes were black and sparkling, her nose just inclining to the Roman, her lips red and moist, her underlip, according to the opinion of the ladies, too pouting. That obviously means the ladies are jealous of her attractiveness. Then Fanny and Adams hear a beautiful male voice singing in the next room, and when it turns out to be none other than Joseph, Fanny exclaims, "Oh, Jesus!" and falls back in a faint. When she revives, she finds herself in Joseph's arms. She whispers shyly, are you, Joseph Andrews? Art thou my Fanny? He answered eagerly, and pulling her to his heart, he imprinted numberless kisses on her lips, without considering who were present. If prudes are offended at the lusciousness of this picture, they may take their eyes off from it and survey Parson Adams dancing about the room in a rapture of joy. After that, the narrator says, O reader, conceive, if thou canst, the joy which fired the breasts of these lovers on this meeting. And if thy own heart doth not sympathetically assist thee in this conception, I pity thee sincerely from my own. That's a direct challenge by the narrator. If you are unable to appreciate this romantic scene, which is introduced with the sexy reality of Fanny, but also her appealing modesty, then you should not be reading this book at all. Fielding is appealing to the implied reader that I talked about in the first lecture in this course, the kind of reader this novel calls. Already, still early in the story, we're developing a relationship with the narrator. On the title page, Fielding explicitly indicates where he got the inspiration for it. It says, the history of the adventures of Joseph Andrews and of his friend Mr. Abraham Adams, written in imitation of the manner of Cervantes, author of Don Quixote. It's true that the narrator in Don Quixote is very much present at all times, commenting on what his characters do, and often dropping in witty asides. Fielding's descriptions, too, tend to be witty rather than neutral. At one point on the road, Parson Adams encounters a fellow clergyman who is too stingy to lend him a small sum of money that he badly needs. An earlier novelist might have simply described the clergyman like this: he had a stateliness in his gait. What Fielding says is, he had a stateliness in his gait when he walked, not unlike that of a goose, only he stalked slower. We'll see in Jane Austen, another version of Fielding's witty and insightful narrator, and many of the great Victorian novelists will likewise be greatly indebted to the Cervantes Fielding tradition: Thackeray, Dickens, Trollope, George Eliot. George Eliot explicitly compares Fielding's method to what she's doing in Middlemarch, the novel with which we'll end this course. Another issue that was mentioned in our first lecture was a modernist dogma. Supposedly, a novelist should show, not tell. Fielding shows and tells very openly, with the intention of giving us pleasure when he does it. It's impossible to imagine this novel without its masterful narrator, just as it's impossible to imagine La Princesse de Clèves told by a narrator like this one. Something that might seem like a minor point, but really isn't, is whether a novel is divided into separate chapters or not. Don Quixote was, with witty chapter titles to prepare the reader for what would be coming next. Robinson Crusoe and Pamela have no chapters, and given what their authors were doing, it would have been a terrible idea to have chapters. In those novels, the illusion is of the continuous flow of life itself, not organized and packaged by the author's skill. In fact, neither Robinson Crusoe nor Pamela admits to having any author at all. Fielding, like Cervantes, sees it as his task to openly shape and package his story. In addition to 64 chapters, Joseph Andrews is divided into 4 books, and at the beginning of each of them, the narrator has an extended conversation with the reader. Launching Book 2, he says, the little spaces between our chapters may be looked upon as an inn or resting place, where the reader may stop and take a glass or any other refreshment as it pleases him. The central character turns out not to be Joseph, but Parson Adams. Here again, Fielding had Don Quixote in mind. Adams is indeed quixotic. He's not delusional, but he does believe everything he's read in books, which in his case are not tales of chivalry, but Greek and Roman classics. Meanwhile, Adams is touchingly ignorant of human malice and constantly shocked by selfishness and hypocrisy. This is how he's described right at the beginning of the story. He was a man of good sense, good parts, that is, abilities, and good nature, but was at the same time as entirely ignorant of the ways of this world as an infant just entered into it could possibly be. As he had never any intention to deceive, so he never suspected such a design in others. He was generous, friendly, and brave to excess, but simplicity was his characteristic. From one point of view, this is naivete. But for another way of putting it is, Adams believes so deeply in the principles of Christianity that he constantly runs into trouble in a world that only pays lip service to those principles. It's very much like Quixote believing in the selfless nobility of the old books of chivalry. There's also a biblical resonance in the names Fielding chose for his characters. At the beginning, he mentions Joey, whom, for a good reason, we shall hereafter call Joseph. The good reason is, in the book of Genesis, Joseph resists the advances of the Pharaoh's wife, after which she falsely claims that he tried to rape her and has him thrown in prison. Fielding may be making fun of Pamela, but he's certainly not making fun of the Bible when he has Joseph Andrews resist Lady Booby. As for Abraham, that's the name of the original Hebrew patriarch. Abraham Adams is indeed a much-loved patriarch in his home village. And although naive, he's absolutely fearless. He dashes right in with fists flying when he encounters someone in trouble. His spontaneous goodness and compassion are constantly highlighted by the selfish and unscrupulous behavior of most people in society. Since Adams gets all his knowledge of mankind from books, that means it's high-minded but very abstract. There's a brilliantly managed episode when it seems, briefly, that Joseph is about to lose Fanny forever. Adams lectures the young lovers solemnly about submitting to the will of Providence and not loving anything in this world so much that you can't bear to give it up. We're meant to think of the original Abraham in the Bible, who was willing to sacrifice his own son at the Lord's command until he was given a last-minute reprieve. At that moment, somebody comes in to say that Adams's son has just fallen into a river and drowned. Parson Adams immediately begins roaring in despair. But shortly afterward, somebody else shows up and says, no, the boy did fall into the river, but he's been rescued. I'm quoting now, the parson's joy was now as extravagant as his grief had been before. He kissed and embraced his son 1,000 times and danced about the room like one frantic. Naturally, Joseph points out the contradiction. Adams defensively explains that parental love is more profound than spousal love. He tells Joseph, every man ought to love his wife, no doubt. We are commanded so to do, but we ought to love her with moderation and discretion. At this point, Mrs. Adams speaks up, don't hearken to him, Mr. Joseph. Be as good a husband as you are able, and love your wife with all your body, and soul too. In the greater part of the novel, Joseph and Adams are on the road together in a series of amusing episodes that owe a lot to the picaresque novel. In his preface, Fielding calls Joseph Andrews a comic epic poem in prose. The Odyssey is a serious epic in verse, in which the hero encounters a series of challenges before winning through to his happy ending. Joseph Andrews is a comic version of that. This concise description, a comic epic in prose, actually tells a lot about the rise of the novel. It's in prose because verse no longer seemed appropriate for telling a story. It still did in the 16th century, in Spenser's Faerie Queene, and in the 17th, in Milton's Paradise Lost. But later attempts to create convincing verse epics all fell flat. Verse is elevated, suited for lofty topics. Prose is what we all speak all the time, and a novel in verse is practically an oxymoron. A popular form in the 18th century was mock epic, using lofty language and epic similes to describe mundane events. The mock epics were usually in verse, like Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, in which snipping off a lock of a young woman's hair becomes a calamity of epic scope. Fielding often includes mock heroic descriptions, which he calls burlesque. In the Iliad, a hero hurls a stone so heavy that a dozen modern men altogether wouldn't be able to pick it up. And when another hero is killed, he fell thunderously, and his armor clattered upon him. In Joseph Andrews, this language is applied to a fight in a country tavern. Joseph puts a stop to one bully by lifting not a stone, but a huge chamber pot, which 6 foppish men couldn't have picked up. Quoting, Joseph discharged it, together with the contents, full in the captain's face. The uplifted sword dropped from his hand, and he fell prostrate on the floor with a lumpish noise, and his halfpence rattled in his pocket. The other piece of Fielding's description of his kind of writing is a comic epic in prose. That mattered a lot to him. Don Quixote is comic, but in later novels, seriousness was increasingly the norm. It's safe to say there is not one laugh in the Princesse de Clèves, or Robinson Crusoe, or Manon Lescaut, or Pamela. More than that, those serious novels avoid what comedy has always provided, not just laughter, but a wish-fulfilling plot that makes everything work out for the best. Of course, real life is seldom like that. That's what comedy is for. As Miss Prism in The Importance of Being Earnest says about her own 3-volume novel, the good ended happily and the bad unhappily. At the heart of Fielding's vision of human behavior is a contrast between 2 fundamental types of character or temperament. One of them he calls good nature. That's an instinctive generosity that Adams and Joseph both share, as do a number of other characters they encounter. The opposite is all too frequent in life. Fielding was a lawyer and eventually a magistrate. He had nothing to learn about the ways people can abuse each other, but that's a reflection on a subset of human beings, not on human nature itself. Fielding makes Joseph suggest an analogy to horses, whose individual temperament is evident right from the start. I remember, Joseph says, when I was working in the stable, if a young horse was vicious in his nature, no correction would make him otherwise. I take it to be equally the same among men. Fielding wrote an essay entitled On the Knowledge of the Characters of Men, and in it he says this, good nature is that benevolent and amiable temper of mind which disposes us to feel the misfortunes and enjoy the happiness of others. It's instinctual or innate. And, Fielding continues, it makes us spontaneously help other people without any abstract contemplation on the beauty of virtue and without the allurement or terrors of religion. Fielding is talking about 2 different ways that writers tried to persuade people to behave virtuously and generously. One way was to theorize philosophically about the beauty of virtue. The other way was to threaten them with eternal damnation if they misbehaved. Fielding is arguing that a truly good person doesn't need either of those external motivations. He or she just can't help feeling empathy for others. Recalling E.M. Forster's distinction between round and flat characters, it's fair to say that all of the characters in Joseph Andrews are flat, in the sense of predictable in their behavior. That's common in comedy, and comic writers generally suggest that all of us are much flatter than we like to think. Remembering that Fielding was a lawyer, it's striking that his narrator says in Joseph Andrews, I describe not men but manners, not an individual but a species. Perhaps it will be answered, are not the characters then taken from life? To which I answer in the affirmative, nay, I believe I might aver, I have writ little more than I have seen. The lawyer is not only alive, but hath been so these 4,000 years. Fielding had deep respect for the law as an institution, but not for all of its practitioners. So he goes on to say, when the first mean, selfish creature appeared on the human stage, who made self the center of the whole creation, who would give himself no pain, incur no danger, advance no money to assist or preserve his fellow creatures, then was this our lawyer born. Something in particular that Fielding was concerned about was the use of the law to defend the privileged classes. In Joseph Andrews, a lawyer says to Lady Booby, the laws of this land are not so vulgar as to permit a mean fellow to contend with one of your ladyship's fortune. Fielding also highlights the bizarre extension of capital offenses to something like 200 crimes, nearly all of which were against property. Capital means you could be executed for them. The lawyer suggests Joseph can be convicted for taking out a pocket knife and cutting a single twig while he and Fanny were walking across somebody else's property. The squire who's going to hear the case as justice of the peace exclaims, "Jesu, would you commit 2 persons to prison for a twig?" "Yes," says the lawyer, "and with great lenity, too. If we had called it a young tree, they would have both been hanged." Believe it or not, that is not satire. That is literally what the law said. Most of the time, Joseph Andrews is a very picaresque novel, relating a series of encounters on the road, many of which could have just as well occurred in some other sequence. But there is an overall plot. The journey brings Joseph from the corrupt city to his rural home, and after he is joined by Fanny, it brings both of them to a happy resolution in the form of marriage. In fact, after all the apparently random events along the way, Fielding pulls everything together. Lady Booby shows up, along with her servant, Mrs. Slipslop. They're here because Mr. Booby is her nephew. To get revenge on Joseph for rejecting her in London, she encourages a foppish nobleman named Beau Didapper to sneak into Fanny's bed and ravish her. Didapper gets confused, however, and instead of Fanny's bed, he inadvertently gets into the bed of the grotesque Mrs. Slipslop. At this point, we're getting not just comedy, but farce, a whole series of manic bed mistakes. Trying to get to his own bed, Parson Adams takes a wrong turn, and he, too, shows up in Slipslop's bed. In the dark, he mistakes the slender fop for a woman, and he starts punching the larger person, who he assumes is a rapist, but the larger person is Mrs. Slipslop. When that becomes clear, Adams rushes away, and then he makes another mistake. He ends up this time in bed with Fanny. He's not even aware she's there, and he sleeps like a baby beside her. Fielding is deliberately recalling an episode in Don Quixote in which Quixote at an inn finds himself accidentally in the bed of a servant. All through this novel, one man after another has been trying to get into bed with Fanny. Now Adams has actually done it, and not only would he never take advantage of her, he doesn't even know it happened. Finally, after all the comedy and farce, there is romance, in the original sense, a fairy tale ending. It turns out that when Fanny was an infant, she was kidnapped from the Andrews family by gypsies. For a moment, this looks like disaster. It seems that in that case, Joseph and Fanny must be brother and sister, in which case they can't possibly get married. But then it emerges that Joseph, too, was kidnapped as a baby. His actual father turns out to be a kindly gentleman named Wilson, whom he has recently encountered on the road, without either of them suspecting their relationship. As in ancient Greek romances, the stolen baby had a distinctive birthmark on his chest. Joseph takes off his shirt, and sure enough, there is the birthmark. Readers familiar with romance conventions would have suspected immediately, when we heard much earlier that Joseph had that birthmark, that it was going to play a role in the plot. So after the picaresque story, suddenly we get a denouement right out of romance. The birthmark confirms that Joseph was actually well born, and now there's no possible obstacle to the happy ending. It's important to recognize that unlike the Cinderella story in Pamela, in Joseph Andrews, this element of wish fulfillment is overt. The behavior of the many vicious characters reminds us that real life does not usually produce perfect endings. A commentator on Fielding says, "Without the conscious intervention of the author, our chances of survival, if we were in the character's place, would not be good."